Welcome back to Eco Criticism 101 and lecture number 12. 12 will be the end of the early modern period for us. We'll be moving forward on the next lecture, but a few more things to cover here that are important. The first half of today's lecture concerned really with literature. So we're going to wrap up with Milton and the significance of Milton's Paradise Lost in terms of local descriptive literature in the history of what's to come, and then Upon Appleton House by Andrew Marvell, because it's sort of a bookend to what we had with the first two country estate poems, but another important link to what will come with nature writing more broadly, which we'll get to in the very next lecture. But Marvell is also interesting, and we're going to read one of the so-called Mower poems. In this period, we've dealt with sort of changing theological views with Christian stewardship emerging. We've talked about the sort of different genres of writing and how pastoral is being sort of modified and brought, into the modern world. But Marvell's Mower poems are interesting because they also show attitudes toward the environment directly changing, and attitudes that maybe not quite. Yeah, well, that is the right way to put it, but there's an uneasiness here with Marvell. So what I mean by all this is we tend to think of something like genetic modification as being a very modern thing. So people are concerned with, genetically modified organisms, GMOs, especially showing up in our food. By the way, that's really not much of an issue anymore in the United States. Not because GMOs have been outlawed, but just the opposite. Because for, a long time now, decades, the law in the United States has been that there is not a need to mention GMOs on labeling of food. So if you pick up a particular foodstuff in the supermarket and you read about the various nutritional stuff, how many calories it has, how much sodium and all that, it will not mention if it's a GMO. But in fact, well over 90% of all the corn that we eat, all the soybeans we eat is genetically modified. And more than that, over 90% of all the cotton that you're wearing is genetically modified. So it is very likely that you have ingested GMOs probably in the last 24 hours or so, and you may well be wearing GMOs right now. But the anxiety over them, genetic modification, goes really back well over 300 years. Not to the specific genetic modification that we do today, where we actually go right in and move genes around, especially now with, CRISPR-Cas technology. But the fact that human beings had been genetically modifying crops for thousands of years. We do it through, selective breeding. So this is before, actual GMOs. This is before hybridization, but it's through breeding. But that selective breeding and other things like grafting had really made remarkable changes to plants. And someone like Marvell is very anxious about all this. He's almost sort of seeing the future coming with what genetic modification could do. But more importantly, in a bigger sense, it's an anxiety over the fact that human beings are changing nature. That's happened ever since Gilgamesh, right? Cutting down the cedar forest. That's a big change to the landscape. But Marvell is concerned that we're stepping it up and we're doing it in new ways. And really nothing new that Marvell is talking about, but the extent to which it is being done is making him anxious. And that anxiety toward human beings changing nature, changing what was there before we came on the scene, will continue to grow for the next upcoming centuries. And that will be, alive and well when we get to Rachel Carson. In fact, it's sort of a hallmark of Silent Spring, this anxiety about what human beings are doing to their environment. So he's an important text that way. And we're going to end with George Herbert and a little poem called Man today. And Herbert is fascinating too because he's concerned about what we're doing insofar as the modification to the environment in England. Specifically the fact that at one time England had, a huge range of indigenous plants. They have basically been swept away by introduced species. A lot of these were coming from the so-called New World. Going to our period here in the year 1500, there were about 200 introduced species in England at the time. So everything was an indigenous plant until the year 1500, with a few exceptions, a couple hundred. By the year 1700, at the end of the period we're looking at, that number had jumped to 20,000. Marvel talks about this as well. Things are coming not only from, all over Europe and all, but all over the world, because the colonial project is underway. And one of the things that colonizers were doing when they got to specific places, they would find plants that they found interesting and they would bring them back. And many of those became commercially viable crops that people were very interested in. A couple examples. One is tobacco. Tobacco is a New World plant from the Americas. And once tobacco is introduced, it takes off in a huge way, presumably by Walter Raleigh. And he's the seafarer who introduces it during Elizabeth's reign. But it becomes a big issue. And by the time Elizabeth's successor, James, gets on the throne, he actually writes a tract telling people to stop smoking because of its health problems. So if you're wondering, how long ago did people know about the problems with smoking? Yeah, it was not just in the 1930s when scientists knew, or in the 1950s, where it was introduced to the general public by publications like the Reader's Digest. It goes way back. And certainly, the fact that the King of England needs to go ahead and write something to tell people that smoking is bad should give you an indication. A crop that wasn't bad that was introduced from the Americas was potatoes. Potatoes were huge because they were a great subsistence food. Potatoes allowed people to, on as little as 1 acre or so, feed an entire family. So it becomes a huge crop for everyday people who, can't afford a lot and suddenly can grow a lot of their own food right there on their property, which they couldn't do before in the same kind of way. I mean, yeah, there are subsistence gardens and all, but to actually meet the caloric needs of, individuals in a family in a small amount of space, that was pretty new. So this is, it has good and bad, I guess you'd want to say, with tobacco and potatoes and a whole range of other crops. But the real downside, the real loser here would be all these indigenous species that are now being supplanted by these introduced species. So again, a very modern problem. We would see the same thing happening all across the world with this sort of westernization of agriculture. But Herbert, in the 17th century had already seen it. So many of these issues we think of as modern, both the root issues and things like modifying plants genetically, and then the anxiety over it, we think is particularly modern, sort of a modern environmental sensibility. But this has been around. These things have been around for a long time. So let's get right to our Prezi and to number 12 here and jump in. And John Milton, this is Raphael visiting Milton. This is Raphael, of course, the angel who visits Adam and Eve in Eden and tells them a lot of things. This is, also I gave it to you because it's 1825, which is the period we're going to be looking at in the next lecture. And it gives you an example of how far landscape art has grown. This is all about the landscape in a way. The human, or in this case, human and angelic presence is not very great, but it's the way that Milton imagined Eden. And that's important because Eden in Milton's mind is very much like the sort of thing that we saw with paintings. If you remember Claude Lorrain, the French painter, who had these wonderful, like photographic realism in his paintings, where the human presence was incredibly tiny. That's what the human presence is in Milton as well. So Milton imagines wilderness in a way that really won't happen. That is the beginning of what will happen in a big way in the centuries to come. So Milton is not the only person who does it. Obviously, Lorraine was doing it in the visual arts, but Milton is a very good example of that early, huge human presence, and that will, of course, grow over time. So I just wanted to show you that. Talk just a little bit about Milton before moving on to Marvel. Paradise Lost is highly descriptive of a locale. So, groves where rich trees wept odorous glums and balm, others whose fruit burnished with golden rind hung amiable, Hesperian fables true, if true here only, and of delicious taste betwixt them lawns or level downs and flocks, grazing the tender herb where interposed or palmy hillcock, and he goes on. So compared to something like De Penshurst, we're just a few decades later, but an enormous amount of description here on Milton of Eden. He just lays it on, describing Eden. And note here, these are odorous glums here, so it's not only the visual that he's trying to invoke here, but the smell of the place. He will talk about the taste of it, the delicious taste here of these, the fruit hanging down. Milton is trying to give you a very complete description of the place. And again, this is a level of description you really hadn't quite seen in the same way before. Here's the reason why. You cannot visit Eden. No one can visit Eden. Eden, even if you are of this belief that Eden existed, it only once existed. It is gone now. So this really is sort of a tour de force display of what loco-descriptive literature can do. Why? Because you're describing a locale that never existed, that does not exist anyhow. So to do that, since you can't in any way rely on your reader's ability to imagine, to remember what it looks like, because no one knows, you have that whole job of doing it. And to a writer and to an imaginative one like Milton, this is, he has a field day with it because he can describe it in any way he wants. He likes to use older descriptions. So if you remember from what I just read, the Hesperian Fables, which is a classical reference, Milton will use those too. And in that sense, he's evoking images that have been developed in literature already. But a lot of it is just him, pulling from the natural world, the world that he's encountered, the things that sight and smells and all. And it's an important loco-descriptive moment because Milton unequivocally wants this to be a celebration of the place that he's describing. Naturally, Eden is supposed to be the most perfect of all places in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. That's it. I mean, there is no place more perfect than it, other than if you get to heaven. We'll talk about that in a moment because Milton sort of blurs those two. But certainly it's meant to be a wonderful place, and Milton has to pull out all the stops to describe it so that if you were reading this, if you did the little experiment I suggested before, if you had your eyes closed and someone were reading this to you, that, you would, be able to imagine it. Not only imagine it, because Milton is very descriptive, for example, with hell too, which is surprising. But in this case, imagine it as wonderful. Of course, that's the case. It's Eden. But writers will come after, and Wordsworth will be an example of who want to describe the natural world as equally perfect or almost equally perfect. Their writing is going to be sort of like this, an over-the-top celebration of the place. Not Eden, but generally speaking, of wilderness. That will be the project that emerges in the 18th century and goes roaring through the 20th into the 20th, roaring through the 19th into the 20th century, and continues today, even in the 21st. A celebration of wilderness, an imagining of areas untouched by human beings as perfect. The Oxford English Dictionary, which is arguably the most accurate dictionary. Okay, people argue about that, but the 20-plus volume OED, Oxford English Dictionary, is pretty darn reliable. They looked into the history of the word nature and how nature moves over time. It's a very complicated history. There are over 60 different definitions of nature, actually. I was actually called upon to write an encyclopedia entry on nature a few years back for the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, and I can tell you, it's a tough job. But the OED identified a particular meaning of nature, a very modern one, that nature is separate from human beings. That sort of defines it. So wilderness is an example of it. The idea of nature is a place untouched by human beings. That's what defines it. And that's a pretty standard definition today. So if you were to think of like nature, or imagine the most nature that you can think of, you might think of something like Yosemite. You might even think further, like part of the rainforest in the Amazon basin where, there are very few people. And in fact, other than, in some cases, people that have never been contacted before first contact with Western culture. But if you trace back the history of when that pretty standard definition emerges today, the OED would argue that it appears in Paradise Lost, that Milton is the one who comes up with this idea of nature being untouched by human beings. And why not? Because other than Adam and Eve, there are no human beings on planet Earth. And Milton makes a big deal of that this is what real nature is. And prior to him, that wouldn't have occurred. It's a very spatial definition, right? Different than the temporal one that we had from the Greeks. But it's pretty much our modern definition. And to a large extent, I would agree with the OED. We have to thank John Milton for consolidating that. Anyhow, moving a little more on Milton here. Milton is a monist, right? So to go back to some of our first lectures about metaphysical dualism, people that imagine a separate realm, heaven, a metaphysical realm different than the physical one here on earth. Milton imagines that earth, heaven, and this third place, hell, are all the same stuff, all made of the same matter. So they are all physical realms. Heaven is not, hell is not a metaphysical realm to Milton. And Milton not only comes right out and says that they are all one matter, all, but then his descriptions of them is consistent with that. So what I mean is all these places, they're filled with plants, with streams, with the mountains. They are like earth. Hell is like earth. It's a worse earth for sure, but it has those kind of features. And heaven is, in the sense, a better earth. But it's all composed of that. And you kind of would have to do that if you're with Milton. If you're unwilling to acknowledge that there's a metaphysical realm and that there's another kind of matter or substance, spirit, the soul. If you're not willing to acknowledge that and you don't believe it exists, then you would do what Milton does, which, says all of this is the same. It's a pretty radical, Christian belief here, but Milton is going to stand by it. And something even more dramatic. Paradise Lost, Milton imagines, what if there hadn't been a fall? So what, and presumably the God of Paradise Lost, the Christian God here, didn't want the fall to happen. He led it up to human beings. It was his test of human beings, and we failed. But if we had not failed the test, what would have happened? And earth be changed to heaven, and heaven to earth. So what Milton argues here is that heaven and earth are so similar, or at least Eden and earth are so similar, that if Adam and Eve hadn't fallen, eventually they would have grown. And as they grew, earth and heaven would have merged. So they would have attained heaven, But with it, with them obtaining it, the earth would have obtained heaven as well. They would have merged into two things. It's a provocative idea, but the underlying idea that earth and heaven are so similar is very radical in Christianity. It's a radical belief for Milton to put it forth. But it also underscores the reverence with which we could and should feel for the earth, and which Milton will do. So I mentioned Milton is part of a group that believe not only could human beings be saved, but the earth could at least, would at least not be in a state of decay, that we could, if not resurrect it, that we could, bring it back as much as possible, save it as much as possible. And if it's that similar to heaven, why not then? So it's a radical belief because heaven could have been on earth or something very similar to it. In other words, since heaven and earth are so similar, if we took care of this planet carefully, why couldn't it be like heaven? And in fact, if that was the original plan, if we hadn't fallen, we would have taken care of it and it would have been like heaven. So it's radically different than to think that the earth is this fallen, debased, place that's in a state of irretrievable decay. And it's a very provocative idea because our posture toward the planet would be very different in this particular Christian thinking, because we wouldn't be, eschewing the earth and seeing it as sin-filled. We would see it as being like heaven and ultimately could be converted to heaven. It's a very remarkable idea, and of course would, make us want to encounter the planet differently. So let's move from Milton to Upon Appleton House by Andrew Marvell. Notice the date here. Andrew Marvell was writing this will be published 3 years after the king is executed during the Civil War, Charles I. And at the time, Marvell is going to be out in the countryside, and he's going to be living on the estate where he's serving as a tutor to Fairfax, who was one of the generals during the Civil War. And he's arguing that Fairfax should come and take over the government and lead the country. Fairfax doesn't want to. Doesn't matter too much from our point of view, but I'm giving you a background here. And ultimately, Oliver Cromwell is the one who takes over for a few years before Charles II, the son of the king, takes over again. But Marvell also has an interesting place in history, and I'll just mention the tie-in to Milton. Milton was one of the people who strongly argued for the right of the British people to execute their king. He writes a tract on it, and he was really pretty central in that band of revolutionaries that tried to take over and succeeded at taking over the government and killing the king. As a consequence, when Charles II comes to power, he starts rounding up all these revolutionaries, including John Milton, and then systematically killing them. Fortunately, Andrew Marvell, who is on the gets into political power and had political power, but is certainly in political power then, Andrew Marvell argues that Milton should be spared. And we all benefit by it, because Milton then, after that period, after being spared, will write Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonistes. Marvell argued that he was just old and blind at the time and wouldn't really cause any trouble. Yeah, well, if you read Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonistes, especially Paradise Lost, you know that Milton actually didn't quite get over that revolutionary thing. And, the story starts, Paradise Lost, with this failed revolutionary who attempted to take on an absolute monarch. That should sound kind of familiar, right? Milton is one of those folks, but the absolute monarch here in the failed revolutionary is God and Satan. So if people have often wondered why Milton is so sympathetic to Satan, people have come up with different ideas over the years, but one of the reasons is he understands that trying to take on an authority and failing. So Andrew Marvell, in terms of what we're talking about here, he writes something called Upon Appleton House in 1652. Recall that this is not that far from the first country house poems, and that would be a description of Cookham by Lanier and Ben Jonson's To Penshurst. but this would be the last of that genre. And again, we really would want to call this a country estate poem. There's some after, and I mentioned Windsor Forest here, which is in the 18th century by Pope. But for the most part, the genre ends here with Upon Appleton House. And you can see it transitioning into something else. And I mentioned why it ends, because loco-descriptive poetry, and we saw this with Sir John Denham, is really taking off, and Denham has a way of making money other than patronage, so he doesn't have to rely on a rich patron asking him to write about his estate. He can write about whatever he wants and sell books about it. Obviously, that's going to be the modern model, that will go forward. That's how people make money today, for the most part, who are writers, is you sell books, or I guess if you're really lucky, you sell film rights to the book. But this is really going to be the case. So Marvell is sort of the end of an era here, and in terms of this particular genre of country estate poems, a pretty short-lived era, just 3 or 4 decades. Yep. It's very descriptive. It's by comparison to either the Cookham or the Penshurst. It's very long, and the description is much more important here. And I mentioned that the Penshurst is like 1/60 a lamb, so it's clearly a transitional work in that it's transitioning from the country estate poem into what we would think of today as loco-descriptive literature. For sure. It's highly allegorical in one sense. So in that way, allegory will continue to be used about speaking about one thing when you mean another. And I mentioned that this is a conspicuous feature of pastoral in the Renaissance. That if you wanted to talk against the monarch or the church or whatever, that you could just couch it in pastoral terms about 2 shepherds complaining about the state of the world, and you could just say, if someone confronted you, it's about 2 shepherds, but really it's an allegorical way of approaching that. This is going to be continuing here in Appleton House, but you'll see that falling away more and more as the description of environments, for example, becomes more and more literal. So it's very biting here, by the way, and it's easy at this time, since England has been a Protestant country for well over 100 years, to take jabs at the Catholic Church. Marvell is really, really vicious here, insinuating, and note that, Catholic nuns are actually lesbians, and he does a lot of allegorical writing here. So he's writing about the Civil War itself too. So this is a pretty traditional Renaissance thing, right? Because it's sort of going back to Virgil's, realization that pastoral could be used that way. But as this is sort of an early modern text too, that will be falling off to the wayside a little as we go forward. Yeah, he expresses here, Marvell, a number of perspectives on the environment. General Thomas Fairfax is the estate owner to which Marvell was writing this poem for, and he talks about Marvell as about Fairfax as being the general that he is. But remember, he's retired now. He's not he's moved away from politics and also being a general to be out in the country. And by the way, this was a very common move at the time. In just a little trivia, you may have heard the expression retreat, like for a summer house, like someone wants to go to their summer retreat or their country retreat more often. That term comes into play here because it's argued that military people like Fairfax had retreated into the country after the war, the Civil War. But the place they go to then is known as the retreat, and over time will be seen as this sort of country or place you could go off to a retreat. Anyhow, just trivia there. Interesting if you read this description, and I won't bother to go through it all. Fairfax is described, naturally, as a general, but he rules over the garden there as a general, and he sort of gets a 21-gun salute from the flowers there as he walks past. And it's a very common way of seeing the relationship between human beings to the environment, to farming and gardening in particular, that we're sort of in control. We're the generals controlling everything. So it's a very high-handed encounter with the environment. And what I mean by that is it's human beings controlling with like military type precision. So if you think about a farm and all, and you imagine, fields laid out in a very geometric way and rows of crops going across in a geometric way and plants being laid out. Yeah, there's a certain kind of military precision to that Marvel wants to draw attention to. And our involvement with the environment can take that form. And Marvel wants to draw attention to that here because, and again, it's a transitional text. In the very same poem, he's going to be talking about something else. So he also, in this estate, it's a large estate, as many of them were, there are old growth forests there. And Marvel is going to talk about them afterwards. And he talks about taking sanctuary in the wood. And, he calls it, this green yet ever-growing ark. And that's a provocative phrase, and people have focused in on that. And the idea that wilderness is sort of like this ark that contains all of the best of nature. So what was the ark? This is the story of Noah and the ark. Genetic diversity was for the planet was supposed to be secured by taking 2 of each animal, so that when they, after the long trip, when they landed on land, all the animals could then reproduce and everything would be okay. To Marvel's way of thinking, wilderness does that. Wilderness is the preservation of all that genetic diversity because it's nature exactly the way it should be. It's unencroached on by human beings. In that sense, Marvel was presaging that definition that Milton helps consolidate for nature, that nature is what's separate from human beings. Marvel's not only going along with that, but Marvel is suggesting that that's really important because, it's almost like the ark. As long as we have wilderness, we're okay because it's preserving all the different kinds of plants, but also animals and birds and fish and everything else. That's the great importance of wilderness, of nature untouched by human beings. So it's interesting, these 2 descriptions, the one I just gave about how we control the earth with military precision in our agricultural projects, and then the further belief that, we shouldn't do that everywhere. We should make sure that we, preserve the earth and all its species and all their diversity in places. And in that sense, the estate, here that Fairfax owns, Appleton House Estate, is this sort of metaphor for the planet itself, how we human beings should, engage ourselves in the planet, what we should do. Sure. Maybe we should, do our agricultural projects, and we should do them with precision and sort of like micromanage the whole thing. But on the other hand, we should make sure that we keep wilderness and all too, because he's very clear that this is an important thing for us to be doing. So, I think that's the big takeaway from it here. He's celebrating the military control, but then awareness of the merit and why, what it is merit for wilderness, but why wilderness is just so precious to human beings and why we need to care for it. So Marvel writes a number of works. Upon Appleton House is just one. Has a series of poems called the Mower Poems. And what I want to do here is just sort of walk through these poems, one of the poems line by line, to see what's happening. This is the uneasiness that Marvel is thinking a lot about nature, right? On the one hand, the military control of nature, on the other hand, wilderness. But what is that military control like? What are human beings actually doing? What sort of modifications are they making to the environment? Well, he's not going to be celebrating, doing this with like a military precision here. He's actually going to be anxious about how we're changing our environment. That should sound pretty modern to you. We're anxious about how we do that today. And if you were to have a checklist of all the things that we're anxious about, and you were to sort of check them off one by one, I think Andrew Marvel gets a lot of them right here. So it's important to think about because we have this view of nature as, again, thanks to Milton and people before him, like Marvel, of being sort of untouched by human beings. But, that notion was that, well, we think that today we would argue that, things should be left, to nature the way they were. At the time, because this is an all-Christian country for the most part, it was thought to be God's creation. And God's creation, in this view, wilderness, should be left the way it was. Why? Well, hey, that's God's work. He created it. This is the perfect God, right? He made this perfect place for us. Why are we modifying it and screwing up? We talk about nature's plan today. Well, back then, the same basic idea, but it was God's plan. And it wasn't, Mother Nature or perfection of evolution and bringing it about the way we might think today, but rather this was God's, plan itself. So let's look at this poem. And we'll go through it. Luxurious bring his vice in use, did after him the world seduce. And from the fields, from the flower and plants allure, where nature was most plain and pure. Okay, you start off with a celebration or remarks on nature being plain and pure. It's simple nature. It's what it is, beautiful plants and flowers in the field. And why is this changed? So you don't get that to the to the third or fourth line there. But luxurious brings his vice in use, did after him the world seduce. There's the notion that the changes talking about here are going to be sort of a seduction of the world, a change of the world. So not only did human beings in their own nature change, the world is being changed too, seduced, which then is a clear reference to the Adam and Eve story, the seduction of Adam by Eve, and arguably the seduction of Eve by the serpent. Either way, what we're talking about here is original sin. Marvel is arguing that nature was once beautiful and pure, and the same motive force that brought about original sin and the downfall of mankind, humanity, would have been male thought of at that time, is happening here again. So, how does this happen? Specifically, how are human beings, bringing original sin to the world? Well, first thing he did is enclosed within the garden square a dead and standing pool of air. This is an important idea. So you have wilderness and fields and all, and this is going to be a specific objection here to gardens at the time. Marvel could have written an objection to farmers' fields and all, and I think some of this would have applied, but here he's talking specifically about gardens. And how were these gardens created? Oh, think of to Penshurst in those photographs you saw of it, and the one before I showed you of a royal residence. First thing that would be done would be to wall off the property around the house. So the country estate in something like upon Appleton House or the Penshurst would have actually been delineated by a walled off garden. Now, why are you making that wall? So we can, go way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh. In part, it's to keep the outside world out. It's to keep animals out that shouldn't be there. So if you're worried about maybe not something scary like wolves, because by this time, 1850s, there are no wolves in England. One of England's great triumphs, would have been seen as a triumph at the time, was the extinction of wolves on the island. That wolves were systematically killed off, and because they were they were the only last predator that could large predator that could come after human beings. Some certain other insects and all can kill human beings too, but the big ones worried about wolves were killed off. So you're not protecting the garden or the estate from that kind of danger, but you are protecting it from smaller versions, maybe like rabbits. Rabbits had been introduced. Rabbits in England at the time were used for like food stuff and things like that. But you wouldn't want to have them. People ate rabbits a lot in the period and raised them to eat. But you wouldn't want to have them in your garden. But if you make sure you get you kill all the rabbits in the garden, you have a wall that they can't get it in, you're sort of protecting it from the outside environment. And that is in large measure why the walls are being built. But also, you're not worrying, it's not a medieval castle and you're not worrying about marauders coming in and attacking, but it is wealthy people building a wall and protecting what's theirs. So you may be familiar with the modern notion of gated communities, which have walls around them to keep other people out. And that's what this was. It's totally an affectation of wealth that you are wealthy enough to do it. But people at the time are going to be very critical of it because, well, the same reason we're critical of gated communities now, it's something that just very wealthy people can have. Marvel argues that you built this, and inside you get a dead and standing pool of air and the breezes can't flow in there. Right off the bat, this is a problem. Milton Marvel doesn't like this. Marvel is of the mind that this is bad. And a more luscious earth for them did need, which stupefied for while it fed. And so what's here, a more luscious earth for them did need. So the gardeners are going to actually be kneading the ground. They're going to be working the ground. They're going to be put in compost and all. And specifically modifying the earth, the soil itself. And we are, concerned about this today, not so much with compost. We tend to like that, right? That's organic gardening. But with using like petrochemical, derived fertilizers and all, things like that, as well as herbicides and pesticides and all. Marvel's argument here is, well, gee, you should let the soil alone, right? God made this soil and it's perfect. And, in a wilderness setting, the way soil builds as plants die and replenish it and all, that's one of God's great triumphs. That's a perfectly sustainable system. Why are you modifying this? Why are you doing it? Well, the answer here, the pink grew then as double as his mind. The nutriment did change the kind. So the idea here is that, and if you're a farmer, you know that if you really, build your soil up, and we call it amending it, if you amend it with things like compost and organic material, you can do all sorts of things, by the way. You can use like seaweed, like kelp and all. You can introduce it to the soil, and it just, makes it more nutrient rich in the sense it has more like carbon and nitrogen the plants need. Well, if you do a really good job of that, these things can double in size, double at least in the mind. But the nutriment did change the kind with strange perfumes. He did the roses taint. So what's that about? Well, here we're getting into the genetic modification thing. That not only is the gardener changing the soil and making it more productive so the plants can grow twice in size, but we're taking flowers and we are selectively breeding them so that they smell better. And this is, if you've ever wondered why, like, you smell a rose and it smells so wonderful, it is not the case that a wild rose will smell anything like that. For, through many, many, many generations, growers were selectively modifying, genetically modifying the plants. Now, again, this is not through GMOs or even hybridization. This is through, good old, open pollination, which had been going on for centuries. But in this period, especially, a lot of attention was paid to gardens and their plants. So it became sort of a high art to modify these plants. And, going back to upon Appleton House, if you remember when Fairfax walks through that garden and gets that sort of 21-gun salute from the flowers, they're sort of puffing out their smell at him. So, if you had one of these gardens, you'd want it to smell really good. And there was a real race among, growers to create more and more odoriferous, more wonderfully smelling plants. And flowers themselves were taught to paint. So what's that about? Use roses again as our example. You may know that you can get all sorts of different color roses. In fact, there's a grower here in Santa Barbara It's one of the largest in California, where you can go. I think it opens about every April, and huge. I think it's a multi-acre area where they have roses of pretty much every color. So not only red, but then white and pink and everything, and yellow and everything in between, and in remarkable color. But again, that's not something that happens in nature. That is entirely a human project, and that was alive and well in this period. And as Marvel's suggesting, we've tweaked the genetics of a plant so that they themselves can paint in different colors, so that they know how to grow, so a plant knows how to grow to be a yellow rose, which is something you just won't find in nature, or a pink rose or whatever. Marvel is anxious about all this. I mean, why are we doing this? We've modified these things, and this is a particularly, I think, powerful way of making the argument. So you could make this argument again with crops that we grow for food, and you could say, well, we've made so corn used to be a tiny little crop in the Americas when it was first raised, but over the thousands of years, we made it into this, really big ear of corn. Well, I think people would be kind of less concerned about that, or have less of a problem with that, because obviously we benefit by it. But this seems like such a frivolous thing to be doing, right? Just to make flowers that smell better and are in different colors. But Marvel's concerned about it. So let's continue with this poem. The tulip white did for complexion seek, and learned to intertwine its cheek. So it's not just that we have this sort of monochromatic, like all yellow rose, that we actually have it, interlined with like colors going around the edge of it and at the inside of it and all. So if you look at a rose, it may not be one solid color, but it has like a blush of color and then sort of the base of color and all. Again, this is nothing natural about this. This is, genetic modification that growers had been doing. And it's not just the flowers themselves were taught to paint, but they were taught to almost do careful little brush strokes in their painting. The onion root, they then, so this is, we're still talking about the tulip, and this is important. It's onion root. So if you know tulips, you don't grow tulips from a seed per se, but it's a bulb, which is, if you're not familiar, it's a pretty big thing. It's like a small onion, and that's what you actually dig up. And if you want to sell, for example, a tulip plant, you wouldn't sell the seeds the way you would for another plant, but you would actually sell that bulb. Its onion root they then so high did hold, that one was for a meadow sold. So what's this all about? Well, when it comes to tulips, then as now, Holland was a leader in this, and the growers in Holland were doing remarkable things with creating tulips that could be, for example, entirely white. This was, for whatever reason, and I think it has a lot to do with perceptions of purity or notions that have been put forth of purity. White was a big color back then. So, for example, potters had spent years, decades and decades trying to come up with the perfect white color for a glaze. You might take this for granted. If you sit down, you can get white glazed plates right and left. They're not very expensive, but at this point that was an amazing thing to have done. And the parallel project for growers in Holland would have been to grow a perfect white tulip. This would have been incredibly rare, so rare that we're in a consumerist capitalist society here, that it's supply and demand. There's a very small supply of this, that one meadow was actually sold. So in other words, someone who had an estate would actually have sold a meadow, like multiple acres, to get whatever that would be, tens of thousands of dollars, all to buy a single bulb for a white tulip. Yeah, there's a little hyperbole there. It's not quite that expensive, or unless maybe the field in question being sold wasn't that valuable. But the notion is an extraordinary amount of money was paid. And what great irony, right? You'd actually sell a field that could raise sort of any crop just to buy a single plant. That really doesn't make much sense to Marvel. Another world was searched through oceans new to find the marvel of Peru. So another world, that would be the New World, the Americas, which obviously by the 1650s are, there are settlements of British people there at the time, and so the colonial project is beginning in the Americas. But it's not just colonizing the place or the people and everything that we kind of think of. Again, plants are being brought back, not just things that have major commercial value like tobacco and potatoes, which we talked about, but this becomes, for people who have these gardens, a treasure trove of new stuff, of plants that were never available before. And the marvel of Peru is an actual type of flower. And, but even if you didn't know that, you would think it's a marvel. It's something amazing that came from, the country or the area of Peru. And that's Marvel is also worried about, and we're going to see when we get to George Herbert in a few minutes, Herbert is worried about it too. So it's not only that you're having these, homegrown plants that you're, teaching to paint themselves, to have different colors and different smells. And not just you're importing things from other places in Europe, like Holland, but all over the world now, that when explorers are going out there, they're bringing back plants. And that's a major project we don't really think much about. We think in terms of, again, colonization, the exploitation of people, slavery and all, which is obviously a huge problem. But another thing that's happening is plants are being brought back to see if they have commercial value. Some, like, potatoes, will agriculturally have value. Others, just because they're beautiful plants, will have value. And you can sell to these wealthy folks who want to have these gardens, which are kind of, they're the estate version of what Ben Jonson was railing against in To Penshurst. In other words, To Penshurst opens with an attack on the prodigy houses, the McMansions of the day, and all the way that they're too opulent. Well, here Andrew Marvell is attacking the estates proper, for all the ways that they are too opulent, in the sense that these gardens are just, they are not, to Marvell's way of thinking, at all natural. Yes, it's plants growing in a field, but it's nothing natural about it. From the very soil itself to the plants, these plants shouldn't be there. They should be thousands of miles away. These plants shouldn't be this color. That's not natural. And this is the anxiety that Marvell has. And with all that, and yet these rarities might be allowed. In other words, we could put up with all this. I mean, this might be allowed, but something worse here. To man, that sovereign thing and proud. So pride, by the way, is generally the thing that brought about the fall. We don't think of it that way today, and many people would argue that's a very good thing. I mean, we have pride festivals, which are very good things. Pride in who you are, regardless of who you are. But here, pride is seen as a problem. It's a very different sensibility than today, if you think about it. So to man, that sovereign thing and proud, had not he dealt between the bark and tree, forbidden mixtures there to see. No plant knew the stock from which it came. He grafts upon the wild, the tame, that the uncertain and adulterated fruit might put the palate to dispute. Yeah, so what's this all about? Well, it's not genetic modification per se, but it is certainly major modification to the environment. What's talked about here is grafting. Grafting had been around for a long time. In fact, it's even mentioned in the Christian Testament, the so-called New Testament. But it really stepped up here. So what's grafting? I don't know if you know it, but if you go to a local plant nursery, wherever you are, you can probably get examples of grafting. If you buy an apple tree, it's almost exclusive. It's almost definitely grafted. So with apples, if you were to eat an apple, and if you were to take the seeds from the core and dry them out and plant them, you'd be disappointed, because the way that open pollination works with apples, there tend to be so many trees around and all, that the two trees that the pollination that happened to allow two trees to create seeds, those seeds would not have very well duplicated either of the parents. So the long and short of it is, you would have a plant, if you planted one of those seeds, a tree that wouldn't have very good apples. They wouldn't be very big, very tasty, or whatever. So how do apple growers, for example, make sure they always have great tasting fruit? Well, they actually grow a tree, which is called the rootstock, and they cut it off at the ground. And what they do then is they find a tree that they really like, a tree that's been very productive, and they take a little branch of it off, and that branch they graft onto that rootstock, and a tree will grow there out of the branch. The roots are from another tree altogether, but the branch will grow into become the tree. And you can play around with that, which is what Marvel is anxious about here. So that rootstock, it doesn't even have to be an apple per se. This is the wackiness of it, because you can find something pretty similar to it. So you will find that a lot with citrus. So like an orange will grow from rootstock that's not an orange. But anyhow, that rootstock, you can choose a plant that doesn't grow very tall, and we call those dwarf species. So you can buy like a dwarf apple if you go to a local grower, or a mid-size apple, or a full-size apple. But the remarkable thing is that the branch that came from, that's going to give you the kind of fruit you want and all, that could be a huge tree. It could be 30, 40 feet tall, and yet you could graft it on rootstock that's dwarf rootstock from a smaller plant, and that apple tree will only grow as tall as a person. You can do things even more amazing than that, and you can go to a local grower and get this today, where you wouldn't graft on just one branch of an apple, but you would do, say, 3 or 4. Why would you do that? Well, you'd have this remarkable tree that if one of the branches was from, a red apple like a Fuji, another yellow one could be something like an opal apple. You could have a green apple there like a Granny Smith, and suddenly you'd have this one tree that would literally grow red, green, and yellow apples. And Marvel is mortified by this because it's happening at the time, and farmers were using this, for example, to great effect, because for centuries, to separate fields, farmers who didn't have a lot of money, couldn't build big walls like these walled estates here, they just planted things. And they planted something that's like a crab apple. You may not know this, but it's almost like a wild apple, and the fruit are about the size of a cherry. They kind of even look like cherries. Not a food that you could eat, but a very robust plant that made wonderful, hedges between farms to delineate them. But from a farmer's point of view, not very productive. But then they discovered, since these were in fact apples, sort of an older, more primitive apple, that if you cut them off, these very productive roots, you could then graft on a commercially viable apple, something like a Fuji or something. And then they wouldn't have had those back then, but something like that. And then you could actually turn this non-productive hedgerow into a productive, like, string of orchard all around your property. And Marvel is very concerned about this, and certainly that it's being done just in gardens here and all. So it's not genetic modification per se, but it's a real big modification to the environment. And coming out of Marvel's era is going to be this sort of, I'll just pull out here for a moment, this sort of increased anxiety that's what we're doing to the planet. So if your gold standard for an environment is, quote, is nature, quote, nature, the way that Milton would define it, a place untouched that's pure wilderness, then, you're going to be kind of mortified as to what's happening to the environment of this particular island. And it's just a little island here, England, but it becomes sort of representative of the whole earth. That what would happen if this happened to the whole earth? Well, over the next centuries, it will happen to the whole earth. In other words, there were places in, the Americas, for example, where, human beings had a minimal presence, and when they did, they weren't doing a whole lot of modification. It's not entirely that simple, because there was actually a lot of modification being done by Native Americans, for example. One of the reasons that the whole center of the continent was that big expanse where, there are buffaloes and all, was Native Americans had modified that there were forests there at one point that they were sort of cut down, burned down, and allowed this one species sort of become a monoculture. That would be the American bison, buffaloes. For the benefit of the Native Americans. But there wasn't anywhere near the kind of modification going on, and large, tracts of the Americas had no modification at all. So England then, for thoughtful people like, Andrew Marvell, becomes this sort of like example of what could happen. So this whole little island had been radically transformed. Where was the nature in the sense of the wilderness? It just wasn't there. It had all been taken over. And how did that happen? Lots of different ways. Introduced species. I mentioned, you go from, in a 200-year period, from 200 introduced varieties of plants to over 20,000. You get through genetic modification, selective breeding to, change the characteristics of plants altogether. You're bringing them in from other countries like Holland, and you're doing, other practices like grafting and all. To Marvell, this is going to bring about a great uneasiness toward human beings changing the environment. It's a very specific example of it because it just involves plants. But it's noteworthy that this anxiety is there, and it's pretty great at the time. It will continue for the centuries to come into our own, in that, we are, I think, rightfully very anxious about the fact that we have now not modified our one little island, but our whole planet in a way to serve human purposes. Well over 80% of the landmass of this planet is under direct human control now. We're using it for our projects. That would have been similar to the percentage of England that was under control of human beings and directly used. And there were areas that were not, but the English people were very quickly working on those. So one would be wetlands. Areas that flooded, or like fens and all that were wet all the time. There wasn't a great commercial use for these. There had been, people have lived there off those during the medieval period and all, but they would use just what naturally occurred there. So eels, for example, were a major food. They were actually used for currency, and sort of the medieval period that, you would trade by, trading 10 or 12 eels or whatever. But with the increased agricultural project, there's a big effort in this period to drain all those areas. And actually, the architects of that came from Holland, because they had been very successful at draining portions of Holland, and they became even more successful as the years went on. But they tried projects to drain fens and other wetlands to convert them into farmland. They weren't very successful originally in the 16th and 17th centuries, but it got more and more successful as time went on. But in that case, it's not just that you're changing the genetic makeup of a particular plant, but you're changing the landscape itself. And again, this is an early modern indication of something that will happen across the whole planet, a major change to the planet, not just to moving one type of plant out, maybe making them extinct to bring in, an introduced species, but changing plants altogether. This had another aspect to it, and we can do this with George Herbert here. Recall that, Marvell was anxious that, these new species were being introduced, the Marvell of Peru, and that, doing that, of course, displaces the indigenous species there. Marvell, is not the only person who thinks about this. So one is George Herbert. This is a little poem called Man. To our modern sensibilities, we would be, I think, not gender specific and just called human beings. We would say more servants wait on human beings than they will ever take notice of. But anyhow, the language here. More servants wait on man than he'll take notice of. In every path he treads down that which doth befriend him when sickness makes him pale and wane. O mighty love! Herbs gladly cure our flesh because that they find their acquaintance there. So what's this about? Well, actually, this is pretty much in full form an argument that you would hear repeated, for example, in the 1980s as well. So 1980s, people are getting particularly anxious about, environmentalists, that we are deforesting the entire planet. So ever since, Gilgamesh's time, where, so Western cultures have gone out and deforested, for example, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, deforested, well, actually, in the Americas, it begins in the 17th century as well. The first law against deforestation in what will become the United States is actually in the 1620s. So human beings pretty much land here, and right away they start cutting down everything they can. And, people get anxious about this, that we're going to do the same thing that we've done in England and elsewhere. And they start making laws against, clear cutting forests. But that will continue. And, by the 1980s, environmentalists especially, have woken up to the fact that, the last great, rainforests, especially the tropical rainforests on the planet in places like the Amazon basin in Indonesia, that these were precious places that we shouldn't cut down. It was there's a certain kind of hypocrisy there, right? A lot of this is sort of coming out of American environmentalism. We're saying, don't deforest your place. But, well, hey, we had deforested our country. It had been sort of a hallmark of the spread of Americans, and by that I mean people in what became the United States, across the United States, was deforestation. But in any event, we started telling people in other parts of the world, stop doing it. And one of the arguments that was used there, in part, that, there were different arguments, and you may have heard some of them, like that the rainforests of the world are the lungs of the planet because they breathe in CO2 and take out and send out oxygen. We needed that for the planet. Yeah, that was part of it. But another argument was made that, well, wait a minute, most of the genetic plant diversity on the planet exists there. I mean, there is such a density of species there, and that exist everywhere, from microbes in the soil, to on the ground itself, to up in the canopy, and all sorts of diversity exists there. So many people argued, actually, ultimately, in the 1980s and onward, that, hey, what if the cure for cancer is there? That's the way it was framed. Cancer was specifically referenced. I think we now know that cancer is not that simple. It's a lot of different, cancer is very different from instance to instance, but it was thought, because that was sort of one of the holy grails of what people were trying to do medically, is get rid of cancer. But what if a plant there actually cured that? And many of the medications that we had, at least early on, certainly in the 20th century, came from plants that actually were naturally occurring. Things like aspirin and all ultimately came from that. And the argument was, we could be destroying something of inestimable value to the human race. Okay, first, that's very anthropocentric, right? Why are we saving it for its own right? No, we're saving it because, hey, we might be able to use it. But anyhow, the argument was rolled out for the preservation of those places. If you look here, that's the same argument that George Herbert has. In every path he treads down that which befriend him when sickness makes him pale and wane. What is that? Well, wouldn't have thought of them as medicines like aspirin at the time, but as healing herbs. Things that may have cured you, that you could have taken some plant and crushed it and made it into a tea, and it might cure what ailed you. The argument here that Herbert's making we're destroying all that by introducing all these new species, by ripping up the quote natural plants, the ones put there by God, and bringing in new ones, these 20,000 new varieties of plants. And what are these? The last lines here: herbs that gladly cure our flesh because they dare find their acquaintance. And what's talked about there is that it's the belief that these herbs actually like contained something that was sort of linked up with human beings, their acquaintance. So we had to have a particular problem, they would be the particular solution. And, again, the anxiety here is that, it's not just that we should care about this in its own right and we should celebrate wilderness, which really is what John Milton will be doing in Paradise Lost. And it's not just that we, shouldn't be bringing in these things from all over the planet or modifying things in all these different ways, but that this might come back and hurt us because we need these plants. They are useful to us. They are important to us, and they might ultimately, be super important if we're actually dying at the time, and it might be the herb that actually saves us. So the big takeaway here is that in this period, human beings are increasingly anxious about what human beings are doing, modifying and changing the environment. This happens on the level of plants, it'll happen on the level of animals, it'll happen on the level of landscape, the fact that we're draining wetlands and all. This preoccupation did not exist before. This preoccupation, in little ways it did here and there, but it's really being consolidated in a big way here. People like Herbert and Marvell, and to some extent Milton, are sort of harbingers then of modernity. They are going to be, expressing the anxieties that will continue on. We're going to see these full-blown in a big way, for example, when we get to Silent Spring in the beginning of the 1960s. But it didn't emerge there. It's coming back, from earlier periods. And England is so interesting in this regard because it's an island. It's, in terms of, the landmass of the planet, it's a relatively small island in that sense. But it proved that if you get enough population in a place, and again, it's a nice contained little example, what can they do? Or seen in terms of the sensibilities that Herbert and Marvell have, what harm can they do? How much damage could they do? How much modification could they do to a place? And what would that be like on a granular level, like in terms of individual plants, what could happen? And they come to the conclusion, a lot. They can completely modify the environment. They can completely change the environment, almost always for anthropocentric reasons, even if they're just basically silly. In other words, to have plants, to have flowers that look a certain way and smell a certain way, that people would go to great lengths to do it. And, that's concerning these folks because, what would happen then? It's concerning them because what had happened in England, but it raises the question, what could happen everywhere on the planet? That larger question, not so much taken up in this early modern period, but will be a distinct question of modernity. And I think people, if we look at the history, through the 18th, 19th centuries, didn't really think that this little island effect could happen worldwide. But ultimately, by the 20th century, by mid-20th century, the realization was that, we could actually do this thing, that we could not only modify a particular, food stuff on a little and modify a little island, but we could do this to a whole planet. And that, I think, is one of the biggest preoccupations that we have today, that we've modified the whole planet. And the example, it's almost like if you looked for what's the proof that we actually modified the whole planet? You can say deforestation or something, but arguably the real proof is the climate crisis, right? That we modified the planet planet so much that we've actually changed the climate. And that is this, it should, there should be the same anxiety, even greater anxiety than Marvel and Herbert have about having changed their little island, England. Okay, so we're going to move forward into another century in the next lecture. So I'll see you then. Take care.